Good evening.
It's better than me singing, trust me. Good evening. Welcome to the fourth and final in our current series, The Constitution, Why It Matters. Voices, in conjunction with our co-sponsor, the Princeton Public Library, would like to thank the Interactivity Foundation for their generosity. We're also grateful to our other sponsors, the Bureau County Republican and Midwest Partners. I do have two quick library announcements. One is that there was a Medicare supplement information meeting this Saturday, open to the public here at 10 a.m. That has been canceled. The gentleman who was to do it is not feeling well and has decided not to get here. And then the eagerly awaited book sale, the spring book sale, is the 19th, 20th, and 21st. So that will begin at 10 a.m. on Thursday. If you are a library friend of the library member, then you have a sneak preview night on a Wednesday, but for the public it opens at 10 a.m. on Thursday morning, 19th. As you already know, this evening is different from our previous events in that we're going to actually end up learning from each other. The same rules as we discussed last week. These are not political discussions. We are talking about core ideas involved in writing and implementing the Constitution. We ask that everyone be respectful, courteous, tolerant, positive, and supportive of other participants. While we encourage you to share ideas outside of the groups, we ask that you not name specific people or quote them without their permission. This, just to go through, the word cloud on the screen here is actually a compilation of, mostly from our discussions last week. This is the visual of what was going around the room when we were doing those group discussions. It's also, it does include a couple of words from along the way from the programs themselves, but this is what you've been talking about for the last 3 weeks. We are so very pleased this evening to have Mr. James Nolan with us as our Master of Ceremonies. I'm going to try to explain what we're doing, and if it's really confusing, I'll get somebody else up here who can do it better, because it is an experiment of sorts. We talked about a trivia night and decided that the most important thing we want to do is actually have the discussion. So we're using trivia questions based on the immigration test. So if you were coming to the States and wanting to become a citizen, these are a selection of questions that are from that test. And what we will do is that Jim will ask a question, and then we'll have a few minutes as a table to come up with an answer, get the answer, and then we can talk about it if it warrants a discussion, or you can ask a question related, or you can ask a non-related question, and we can talk about it. But anyway, it's kind of open-ended, and as I said, really the most important thing is that we get a chance to kind of talk about these concepts. Is that kind of clear? Is that okay? All right. And then afterwards, we can maybe talk about what might be some good answers for the future. Jim is uniquely able to help answer questions and give us insight into the politics of the Constitution. He's been politically active throughout his life. He's had many and varied positions and appointments that have included his undergraduate degree was in political science from the U of I. He also completed his master's and doctorate both in political science also at the U of I. He has been a member of the Illinois House of Representatives. He was a senior fellow for the Institute of Government and Public Affairs and director of the Civic Leadership Program at U of I, taught courses in American politics and public management. In addition to continuing applied research and writing on public policy issues, Jim provides commentary and analysis for media and civic groups. Many of us know him through his opinion pieces, which are carried by newspapers throughout the state. Please help me in welcoming Jim Nolan.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. She forgot to mention that among my checkered political career, I've also worked for 3 unindicted Illinois governors. I'm going to provide the briefest thumbnail of context for our discussion today. I think it was Rousseau who said that life in nature is nasty, brutal, and short. And indeed, I think we all, whether conservative, liberal, or moderates, hope that our society will provide order, harmony, and prosperity. Well, how do you do that? In the Enlightenment, Rousseau and John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, from different perspectives, started talking about a social contract between the governed and the governors. And for that, you need a kind of rule book. And that's basically what a constitution is. It tells what government can do and what it cannot do, what citizens can do and cannot do. Now, the English have an unwritten constitution that's a mix of their laws and traditions and social customs, but they consider it a constitution. But it's not written down the way ours is, and ours is probably the oldest continuing constitution in the world. Now, I'm not an expert on the Constitution. I know a lot about American government and politics. So you may know some things about the Constitution I don't, and I hope you'll bring them out. Now, some of these questions, which I'm going to get to immediately, are short answer, or shouldn't, or may not take a long time to answer. Others may take more time, and we'll see how this goes. But the objective is that we understand where the prospective citizens are coming from as they answer questions on the immigration test. So, there are 3 rounds of questions, each with 4 or 5, and I'll just throw out a question. You guys in your small groups, try to answer them, and then we'll discuss them if necessary, and if not, we'll move on to the next question. So, and some of them are tough, some of them are easy. First one, how many amendments, yeah?
Open book or non-open?
Stephanie, you're the parliamentarian, I don't care.
It's an important question.
It is important. Let's do without the books to begin with, and then as they get harder, we'll see. We'll negotiate.
Okay.
Now this first,
Have a book for rep.
now this first one, I wouldn't have answered correctly until looking into it. How many amendments does the U.S. Constitution have? And after I think you may have come to an answer, I'll just go around the tables, and one of you at each table might be designated to pop up, not stand up, with an answer. Okay, how many amendments does the Constitution have?
Somebody want to vocalize that? 27.
Okay. You said? Okay.
Yes, 27.
Okay.
27.
Okay, 27. Next question. Under the Constitution, some powers, under the Constitution, some powers belong to the federal government. What is one power of the federal government that it can do that the states, part of the federal system, cannot do? And you don't have to answer to me, answer to your group, and then we'll go around. We'll see how many we can come up with.
When's that? The 28th. Which one's that? Oh, it turned out a long time ago.
No, that's what's because there are amendments to the Constitution were not ratified for more than 100 years, 120 years.
Well, this one has been on for
I mean, that's the discussion. I mean, the others,
Because if you look at the other ones they have.
Did they? I don't know.
Okay, why don't we go around the table and just identify some of these powers that the national, called federal, I can call federal government, but it's really the national government. What powers do they have?
Declare war.
Declare war. And at your table, anything different?
Foreign affairs.
Foreign affairs,
Coin money.
coin money,
Regulate commerce between states and impose tariffs.
good deal. Any others? Treaties. Okay, okay. House of Representatives has how many voting members?
This is what we want.
Close your book, close your book.
It's on that.
It's on the, okay, let's start with this table. We'll start with you going around. How many representatives?
435.
That's correct, that's correct. Are there any others who sit on the floor of the House or can?
Yes, the representative from the District of Columbia.
Correct, non-voting delegate. I wonder if the other territories also have non-voting delegates. Guam and
That's a
Samoa.
question I wanted to discuss later, because I think it's possible for, somehow, there to be more than 435. It seems to me like in the first discussion, one reason they didn't want more than that was the building wasn't big enough. And I'm curious how, if, say, I don't know, say we decided we were gonna, well, what happens if Puerto Rico becomes a state? Will we have more?
Yeah, we haven't always had 435. There were times when we had fewer, I'm sure of that. And I think the Constitution talks about 30,000 per representative being a minimum, but I don't know that there's a maximum number. I think that's, but it's been 435 for as long as I can remember, and that's a long time. What is an amendment to the Constitution? What is it? These are all, Stephanie, these are all questions that are asked of prospective citizens, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But there was
Stephanie?
No, I was going to say, in that information question, there's a paragraph at the beginning that tells about the test.
Not in, okay. Not in mine.
Okay.
Why don't you read it if you have it?
Let me find it and I will, let me grab that. I'm sorry.
We know there've been 27 of them. We already answered that. What were the first 10 amendments to the Constitution called?
Wait a minute, the question was, what are amendments?
What is an amendment? I'm reading from your script.
Yeah. It's
It's a change or an addition to the law, federal law.
There have been 10,000 plus amendments proposed in the Constitution. And there are, how do we amend the Constitution?
It ain't easy.
Okay, 2/3 of what? How do we amend the Constitution? How, the process.
Ratified by the state.
State ratification.
Okay, state ratification, but how does it start? What do they ratify? Who starts?
Two-thirds of the Congress or two-thirds of the states asking for a constitutional amendment. You have two ways.
4 ways.
Oh, I'm sorry.
4 ways. Congress, by 2/3 vote, to the legislatures, 3/4 must ratify, or 3/4 of state conventions must ratify.
Well, you've actually answered two questions. Let's take it in two questions. First of all, how is it proposed? And second of all, how is it ratified?
But isn't
How are
the,
amendments made? Yeah.
isn't the answer, the question on the civics test that immigrants have to pass to be citizens, this is the way it's asked?
What is an amendment?
Yeah, what is an amendment?
Excuse me, when they answer these questions, do they answer them just with short answers, or do they do a multiple choice test?
Don't know the answer.
It's a multiple choice test.
Yeah, they're usually multiple choice.
Okay, this is, sorry, I didn't know this was there, and I apologize. Before taking the oath of allegiance, would-be citizens must pass a civics examination covering America's history, principles, and system of government. For the test, a United States Citizenship and Immigration Services officer randomly selects a set of 10 questions from a list of 100 and reads them in English to the applicant, who must orally answer at least 6 correctly. Some, like name the president or what is the U.S. Capitol, are easier than others, raising concerns about whether all applicants have the same shot at passing. Here we are testing you on some of the tougher questions. The immigrants applying for citizenship are given 2 chances to pass the test before they must restart the application process from scratch and pay the filing fee of at least $640 again. If they fail at their first interview, they must retake the civics exam and another interview between 60 and 90 days later. So that's the setup for doing the test.
Okay. Back to your point, sir.
Yes, sir.
Congress to the conventions, Congress to the legislatures, or there can be a convention of the states. And then if the convention of the states, with 2/3 of the states wanting a convention, is held, and it's never been done, then it goes either to the state legislatures or to the, to a convention of the states to ratify what is proposed. Anyway, there are various ways to do it. 10,000 have been proposed, 27 have been adopted. 1938, there was a proposal to forbid drunkenness. And there have been all sorts of crazy, not crazy, but proposals that didn't pass muster. There are 4 amendments to the Constitution about who can vote. Describe one of them. We'll see if we can come up with all 4. I'm sorry.
They didn't have to be white. So that's an amendment, that was last year. Okay, we ready? Let's go to this table, the first table here. Okay,
Women's suffrage.
Women's the 19th. Next table. Any suggestions here at the next table?
Fourteenth Amendment.
14th, male citizen, or excuse, any race, I mean, okay. Back there, any additions to those?
Voting age to, yeah,
Voting age 18, 26, okay. There's one more that I might not have gotten.
the 15th Amendment.
The 24th Amendment in 1964 made poll taxes illegal. Which is interesting. The civil rights amendments were the 13th, 14th, and 15th, and the 15th being any person of any race can vote. And yet, as we might recall, after the war, the Civil War, and after Reconstruction in 1876, then many states in the South in particular began to impose Jim Crow laws, quote unquote, that began to re-segregate and, in a sense, reinstitute something some people would call quasi-slavery. The point is, poll taxes were one way of keeping blacks from voting because often they weren't able to pay the poll tax. And there were other ways of keeping blacks from voting. There were states in which you had to be a member of a party to participate in a primary. Well, the Democrats controlled the parties in the South. And if you weren't a member of the Democratic Party, and I think they basically restricted it to whites, you couldn't participate in the primary. And we know that often the primary election is the election, because in many parts of the country, one party or the other is dominant. So you win the primary, you're likely to win the general election. Yeah,
If
Rick.
I may say so, I'm just reading the amendment, and the word race doesn't show up. And so, de facto, it would be people who don't have the money to pay anybody who doesn't have the money to pay a poll.
Yeah, that's true, but generally, the societies let the whites pay.
Right.
Or vote. That's a good point.
Yeah, I think that a lot of disempowered people, at the time, probably the most predominant issue was race. People-
How does the amendment read? You say it doesn't mention race.
Okay, here we go. The right of citizens of the United States to vote in any primary or other election for president or vice president, for electors for president or vice president, or for senator or representatives in Congress, shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state for reason of failure to pay any poll tax or other tax.
When was that?
64.
Yeah, it was passed in 1962 and ratified in 1964.
But the impact was basically to prevent.
True, but what interests me is, I didn't know this, for any reason of failure to pay any poll tax or other tax. So how about somebody who doesn't earn property, can't afford to own their own house, doesn't pay property tax, doesn't, say you can't read, you can't have a job, you don't have enough money to pay a poll tax. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons. Race was the de facto primary issue, but I think a lot of other people were being denied the right to vote.
May have been. I mean, I don't know the answer to that.
Well,
And there were other ways of keeping people from voting as well, and that was a constitution test,
Right.
which I think was applied mostly to blacks and not to whites. I mean, the poll judges could require a test of those they felt should have it imposed upon them, but I think it was basically upon the minority there.
Jim, the other issue, and this is interesting, it's, well, these rights shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state by reason of failure to pay any full tax or other tax. So, say there must have been states, Mississippi, for example, or Louisiana, that might have said, well, sorry, this is the way we do things here. And this amendment said, you can't discriminate in this way. Right?
Yeah. With poll taxes, yeah. And so it, well, 1964 was the era of the civil rights amendments.
Yeah.
Of which this obviously, or civil rights laws, of which this amendment was one. Okay, so any other questions or observations related to who can vote? So even though the Constitution might say something, doesn't mean that it's always followed verbatim.
I just like to throw out the interesting point that that only applies to federal elections. The states, it doesn't say anything about the states there not putting restrictions on their own within state elections.
Yeah.
And
They're only talking about federal candidates.
Right.
Just throwing that out there.
yeah, that's a good point, because we have a federal system, it's a dual system. You have national laws and you have state laws, and state laws, basically state laws do govern elections.
So I think probably, I'm just thinking about it, so probably a lot of people in the South, being black, for example, perhaps they wouldn't have to pay a poll tax to vote for president, but they might be disenfranchised to vote for local leaders or state leaders with poll tax, unless there was a law against it in a particular state. In other words, there would be other ways. This is only stopping people from being disenfranchised for federal elections.
Yeah, my guess is that the poll taxes were imposed by the state governments and therefore applied both to federal and state offices. I would almost bet my bottom dollar on that.
I wonder if there are cases that have been brought up. Right now, there's a lot of states that allow prisoners to have the right to vote. And by virtue of not having any, well, they can't have poll taxes, but back then, there were probably a lot of disenfranchised people. Abandoned spouses, poor people, homeless people, none of whom had the money to pay a poll tax.
Yeah. Well, the original concept of our Constitution was that it was a republic, not a democracy. And lots of people were originally expected not to participate. I mean, originally it was white male property owners. And then over time, property was eliminated. And as we know, these other things were eliminated. But you're right about the incarceration. I think Illinois is one state in which persons who have completed their terms in prison are allowed to vote. I think Florida is one where it's maybe an issue right now as to whether they can or
There was a recent
cannot.
ruling, wasn't there?
Was-
Because they had, the law then in Florida said, well, okay, but then these felons have to pay any fines that they owe before they can vote. And I think that went to the Supreme Court recently.
And the court probably knocked it down.
Yes.
Said-
But there's a lot of efforts to try and keep people from voting, like, okay, you have to have a photo ID to vote. Or you can be registered, but after 4 years, we're gonna throw you off the roll, so then you've gotta come back in and re-register. I mean, there's all kinds of sneaky ways the states try to discourage people from voting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to get back to the states, generally control the election processes within the respective states until something is maybe appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, where sometimes those are, they're struck down. It's interesting how we use the Constitution and then we try to adjust it to our objectives. I mean, if you restrict voting, you do so on the premise that it's going to affect, quote, the other party, more so than yours in terms of people who have been incarcerated. When I was a state legislator, there were 7,000 persons in Illinois prisons. Reached a high 2 years ago of 49,000, 7 times as many. So that's and of course people are being released all the time, so the number of ex-felons in society in Illinois would probably be in the hundreds of thousands. And whether they can vote or not could be a factor in the outcome of certain elections.
I think the question, too, is still open, should felons be allowed to vote? If you committed some heinous crime and you served your time, well, that's fine, you release back out into society, but really, should you have the right to vote again? I'm not saying whether you should or shouldn't.
I know,
But I
I know.
think there is a legitimate question.
Yeah, well, and going back to the original white male property owners, it's always been a question, you know, who should be allowed to vote. The original republic of our original Constitution would not even have considered that question, you know, because they wanted it to be limited to an elite, if you will. And the U.S. Constitution has those kinds of elements to it. The United States Senate members were originally elected until 1913 by the state legislatures. The original presidents were elected by an electoral college, which we still have, but originally it was to be a group of high-minded folks, white male property owners, who would make the selection. So we've been democratizing it ever since. For you know, yeah.
There's something I'm very ignorant on this, is that where does it say, you know, back when they first put the Constitution into effect, where in the documents at that time does it state who got to vote and who didn't get to vote? I've never seen it, I don't really know.
Each state determined the qualifications for voting. And so it varied. I'm guessing, I don't know the detail, but it varied from state to state. Because in the original elections for president, some state legislatures selected the electors, and I think other states had other ways of coming up with these electors. So it was state by state.
I think they're still doing that on the question of if felons can vote. because
State by
nobody
state,
was-
yeah.
Yeah, Florida recently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, let's see, we're at question, or round 2 question. Under our Constitution, some powers belong to the states. What is one power that the states have that the national government, that belongs to the states? What power or powers belong to the states?
But you just, yeah, that-
We just went over, but voting's one of them.
Right.
States still set their own parameters.
Okay. Quiet around here. There are a lot of things that states do.
But here's the question.
They can restrict abortion.
Do states,
States have the right to say a lot of things on unskilled work. They can limit or make it hard for states to do it, like they've done in Texas, in certain places. They can work things and make it.
well, what about, gerrymandering? Do states have the right to determine what the districts for voting are?
Yeah,
if it violates federal, I mean, previous amendments, like civil rights, for example. Couldn't the case be brought that, a state comes up with a terrible law, you know, and the federal government, Supreme Court, somebody sues, it goes to the Supreme Court, they say, well, you have the right to do these things except when it violates federal law. Isn't that what happens in the Supreme Court?
Well, didn't one of gerrymandering at, just got tossed back last year?
Mhm.
And then one was upheld, right, and they were forced to redistrict, and then another state, they tossed it out and said, yes, it was gerrymandering, but it didn't violate any
But
rights.
the difference was that, I believe in Pennsylvania, it had come from, they said it had come from their state constitution. And so it was violating their state constitution, whatever it had done, and in the other state it was not.
Okay.
So I think that's what the difference was, because it went back to.
Now,
state.
in terms of districting, which has to do with gerrymandering, until 1962, the states had complete control over how the districts were drawn within the state. In Illinois, from 1905 to 1955, there was no redistricting of our legislature and congressional districts, even though the state constitution said it shall be done every 10 years. So our state was ignoring this requirement that the state imposed on itself to redistrict, which benefited whom?
Well, in Illinois?
I'm talking about Illinois, this is within Illinois. Who did it benefit? It benefited downstate because where was all the population from?
Right.
In the metropolitan Chicago area. So in 1962, in a decision called Baker versus Carr, the U.S. Supreme Court said, after having rejected lots of other efforts to impose redistricting reform on the states, said equal protection under the laws of the 14th Amendment requires that there be some equality of population within the respective districts within a state. Because in California, you had LA County with millions of people electing two state senators, and then you had a little rural county of 10,000 electing two state senators. So ultimately, the U.S.
Right.
Court used a U.S. constitutional provision to tell the states what it had to do because of.
So what was the question again, Jim?
What are some things that states do?
What are the powers to the states? Yeah,
Okay.
now do it within your groups.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay, do it within the groups. Okay. Oh, question. Stephanie has a question.
No, I'm sorry, pertaining to that, I understand that one of the counties in southern Illinois is going to lose the representation of the state because the population decrease. And has anybody else heard, do we know anything about that? How
No,
does that work?
I
Does
think
somebody else-
what you're getting at is that southern Illinois, deep southern Illinois, always had a congressional district. But the population has declined so much relative to the rest of the state that now they're carving up southern Illinois into several congressional districts. Because each district has to have the same population.
And this, I know there was something about with them losing the state rep, that it was changed, that there's this big thing going on in southern Illinois about how to make that happen, or whether it's going to happen.
Yeah, it now has to be equal population for each district, state legislative, U.S. congressional. And if you're losing population relative to the rest of the state, you're gonna lose the number of districts you're gonna have.
Well, if that, depending on how that turns out, if you're looking at the number of people, if there are seats that are not filled, will another district then by population gain that seat in another one, or will that just disappear? And do you know the answer?
Well, the answer is simply that it's not that everybody will have representation. It'll just have a different set of district lines. So nobody loses the right to vote for something.
within another district, but that's what I'm saying, is that they will no longer be the district with their
Okay, so-
representative,
yeah,
that way it'll
I'm
be
with
somebody
you.
different as part of another district. So they're going to have to redistrict after the census, no matter what.
After every census, they redistrict.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Okay, other power, this is still
Yeah.
on redistricting?
no, I related to
States,
this.
yeah.
The question is, what's the question again?
What powers belong to the state? Rather, the 10th Amendment of the Constitution says all those powers not given to the national government
Yeah.
are reserved to the states.
Okay, so
So
wouldn't
what are
that be
those powers?
the crucial point about almost every issue the Supreme Court deals with? Talk about civil rights. In Alabama, George Wallace says we can let whoever we want into we can discriminate whatever way we want, segregation now and forever. And the Supreme Court says no. All right, and second example, same-sex marriage. You know, states have the right to make those laws, right? But then it was the Supreme Court that overruled the right of different states to say, well, we allow, we don't, we sort of do, we have these other ideas. The Supreme Court says, no, that's a form of discrimination that's prohibited in the Constitution. So what interests me about all of this, seems to me like, this is the ongoing antagonism between states' rights and a federal government, which says, we have federal rules as stated in the Constitution, we have a Bill of Rights. If your state passes a law that is inconsistent with the original Constitution and the Bill of Rights, you're out of luck. We are supreme.
Yeah, oh, there's a supremacy clause in the U.S. Constitution. So, national laws trump state laws, but there are some things that are not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution as
Right.
powers of the national government. So the states are to do those things.
Until they're told not to, but the Supreme Court says that's really our right.
No, they're not told that they can't do them. So schools, there's nothing in the Constitution about schools.
Well, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education.
That's not a power, that's an interpretation. The court interprets, but
States have for elections, we've just been talking. about
elections, okay. Education, we do not have a national education system. Your district is not part of the U.S. School district. Police protection. That's not mentioned in the Constitution. We don't want a national police force, I sure as hell don't. Zoning, land use, public sanitation.
Right.
Those are all, since they're not mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, they're supposedly reserved to the states. And so, transportation, welfare, so on. So those are basically state functions. The state legislature spends all its time, not all, it's lots of time on education, transportation, welfare, judiciary. Most court activity in the U.S. is state court activity. There are federal courts adjudicating federal laws, but most of us, when we are threatened by being sent to the hoosegow, are being done so in the state court system. So now let me complicate that by saying the national government has tried to impose itself so that it can say things about how we do education through the use of money. The national government prints money. States can't print money. We just talked about powers of the national government. And so, education. Princeton High School, Princeton Elementary School, property taxes, state school funding, And 10% of all the money going to the Princeton school districts comes from the national government to help with programs for the poor and so on. That 10%, the national government leverages that. Congress says, if you want our 10% for your school district, you must do the following. Education of all the handicapped. That's a national law. And it is based not on their control of education, but they're saying, if you want national money for your schools, you have to abide by the Education of All the Handicapped Act. Transportation, same thing. That federal money comes to the state and local communities for transportation, and they have a say in how your local road commissioner, county superintendent, etc. operate. Same thing with welfare, healthcare, Medicaid. The states do not have to participate in Medicaid, which serves 3 million Illinoisans out of our 12 million plus. But the national government provides half of the money, provides 63% of the money for Indiana and Iowa, only 50% for Illinois. That's another topic, and it amounts to billions of dollars in difference. But the point is, every state in the U.S. ultimately signed on to Medicaid. Arizona was the last one, just 20 years or so ago, because they couldn't afford not to take the money for the health. Anyway, and so that gets us into this marble cake of national, state, and local governments. It seems so neat. National government does this, state governments do this, local governments, which are creatures of the state, not of the national government, do this. But with federal money flowing through, about 25% of the Illinois state budget's federal money, they leverage that to tell us what to do, for better or for worse. I mean, some of us would like what the federal government tells us to do, and some of us would not. Anyway, I'll quit lecturing. I used to do that. I used to do that for a living until they fired me. Let's see. We elect a U.S. Senator, and just like Rick, please prompt us with your questions and comments. We elect a U.S. Senator for how many years?
6.
That's pretty easy. Yeah.
No discussion there.
Yeah. 6 years, I'm trying to think. In Illinois, in 1909, this will be the last story I'll tell. 1909, William Lorimer, in 1909, the state legislatures elected U.S. senators. 1909, the Illinois legislature couldn't agree on a U.S. senator. The Democrats were here, the Republicans had the majority, but the Republicans were divided, so they couldn't agree on who the next U.S. senator would be. Long story, but some East Coast interests brought $100,000 out to Illinois when that was real money, gave $2,500 each to 40 Democrat legislators when a Model T cost $750, to vote for William Lorimer, a Republican boss in Chicago. Politics were different then. And Lorimer was elected to the Senate, but it was found out that he was elected as a result of bribery, and so after two or three trials in the Senate, he was expelled for bribery, which by the way was never proved. It was only alleged, but everybody knew it happened. Anyway, he was expelled, and that reignited interest in what amendment? 16, 17, to move to popular election of United States senators. another move away from republic to democratic concept. Okay. When was the Constitution written? 1787. Okay. What does the president's cabinet do?
The current one?
That's what it's doing.
Theoretical answers.
Before anybody says anything, I disagree with the official answer to that question on the test itself.
Okay.
What is the official answer?
The official answer, I believe, is they advise the president.
Okay.
And they kind of left out a few things, don't you think? Because those cabinet members make all kinds of decisions that the president either approves or sort of likes or doesn't, and, I mean, they make all kinds of decisions all the time. They manage part of the executive branch of government. They don't just advise the president, they manage it. Now, maybe, you know.
Yeah, they're the chief executives of their departments, is
Yeah.
what you're saying.
So
Yeah,
it's a pretty
But on
simplistic
the-
answer to a complicated question.
But on the big policy issues, they advise the president, or at least they did. Doris Carnes Goodwin wrote the book Team of Rivals about Lincoln and his cabinet, in which he, a very savvy, wily politician, said the only way we're gonna make this work during what's gonna be a civil war is to bring in my opponents. And so he had most of his opponents in the 1860 election, he appointed them to be cabinet members. Salmon Chase was the treasury, let's see, help me out here, there were several
Stanton.
other.
Stanton. for war.
Stanton was war, and Seward was Secretary of State, and so on. So the cabinet advisors, it developed over the years, this concept of the cabinet. They didn't have formal powers. And Lincoln once said, after a vote around the table of his cabinet, he says, "The vote is 6 nays and 1 aye, and the ayes have it." But now we've kind of moved away from the cabinet system. Most cabinet members, and there are about, 10 or 12 departments now, are not really close buddy advisors to the president. The way they were literally in Lincoln's time. I mean, he did rely on them, even though he didn't always agree with them. Now you have what I'll call a kitchen cabinet, or close advisors whom the president relies upon, who are in the White House and they don't run agencies. In fact, many of the cabinet officials don't have much power because there's a shadow cabinet person in the White House who is basically running the agency because he or she is closer to the president than the people who are appointed to be the cabinet officer. So things evolve over time. Okay, what are 2 ways that Americans can participate in their democracy? And among yourselves, and then we'll kick them around. What are 2 ways that Americans can participate in their democracy? Excuse me for working around, I just feel I need to. Sorry.
You should have been here last week.
What?
The guy was like a pinball last week. Watch the video, it's on YouTube.
Under the table thing. I mean,
I think
I
it
have
is
a
legal.
I have a former student who's arguing for, case with Supreme Court that big money, big corporate money in politics is a violation of our civil rights. And that was,
Okay, let's go around, let's start here. What are two ways that Americans can participate?
You can run for office, or you can write letters / phone your representatives.
Okay, run for office, write letters,
You can bribe public officials.
bribe public officials, okay.
And vote.
Down here in Illinois.
In Illinois, since 1976, 2,000 persons have been convicted of public corruption. Not all bribery, but a lot of bribery. I think we have a kind of culture of corruption in Illinois, but that's a little bit away from the topic. Okay, Stephanie.
I will only say with those numbers, I actually had to do that for a report last year. We're not the worst, we're average in the country for number of people who have been prosecuted. Just say, we're not right.
So we can write letters, we can run for office, we can bribe our congressman, we can, what else? Vote. Serve, run for office and serve, right? This,
Jury, be on a jury.
that's a good one, yeah. Protest, good, petition your government, that's a right in the Constitution, a freedom, petition the government.
Anybody say vote?
Yeah, well, I think somebody did.
apparently we can shield our individual, rights to corporations so that they can decide for us, for good or bad.
He's referring to a Supreme Court decision called Citizens United,
Right.
which states that corporations are,
People
people, yeah,
have the same
are
rights as
are individuals, yeah, and participate and contribute, yeah. We can get into that a little later. But that's interesting that in the answers provided here, what ways can you participate? I'll just repeat: voting, write letters. I wonder how, in this digital age, that's interesting. Write letters, ask questions, join a civic group, write a letter to a newspaper, run for office. Nothing is said about political parties, which used to be the primary way in which you participated. You became active in a political party, and you might want to become a precinct committeeman or woman. And through the party, you work to nominate your friends or people you agree with to office. I mean, in Bureau County, in the past, I don't know about the present, Bureau County was always a Republican county. You had the East with its Democratic bias, but it was mostly a Republican county. Most of downstate was Republican. In many downstate areas, the person you nominated in the Republican Party was the one who was going to be elected. Sometimes the Democrats didn't even run anybody. The reverse in Cook County, where the Democrats controlled and the Republicans didn't have a chance. So the nomination was in effect the election. But parties are very weak now because you can't get jobs through the party the way you could 40, 50 years ago. There's just little interest in being a precinct committeeman. Very few committeemen are elected at the primary next week. There'll be when you go into the ballot, you'll see lots of precinct positions, and most of them have no candidate because people aren't interested in doing it. So the county chair of either party has to go find people and appoint them to be precinct committee. The political parties are much less important than the political party organizations are much less important than they used to be. Okay, round 3 questions. What is one promise you make when you become a United States citizen? What is one promise you make when you become a United States citizen. This is given, most of us don't face that because we're born citizens. So this is to somebody who is wanting to become a citizen.
Well, one of them would be to give your loyalty to the government. In other words, you are promising not to participate militarily on behalf of another foreign power.
Loyal, okay, others? Loyalty to the United States.
Uphold the Constitution.
Defend the Constitution. Obey the laws.
Is that in the Boy Scout law?
I don't,
I mean, what are the words, what is the oath? I'm curious. exactly.
Boy Scout oath, we're talking about the Constitution.
That's my point. What does loyalty mean? And what do all these mean? What is the oath that you say? What are the exact words in that oath? I don't know.
Here, I have it. Stephanie was good enough to provide it. The oath, hold your right hand up to my left hand, with your right hand. This isn't too long. I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure, reject, all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty, of whom or which I have heretofore been a subject or citizen. Meaning, if I were a German, and, no longer a German, that I will support and defend the Constitution and laws of the U.S. against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same. I will bear arms on behalf of the United States when required by law. That I will perform non-combatant service in the armed forces of the United States when required by law. That I will perform work of national importance under civilian direction when required by the law. And that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, so help me God. So that's what it says. Well, here's an interesting point. I just learned this afternoon because I wanted to check it out. It says, I renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign country, but there are dual citizenships allowed by the U.S. So this is not in the Constitution, this is no. And the U.S. government has said that since it isn't in the Constitution, persons can be dual citizens, which is it's in contradistinction to this oath that people are taking, which is interesting.
Well, be amended.
Yeah, well, amend the oath, right?
It depends on if you are an Olympian and they need you.
Well.
You can do it, but it used to be that as an American citizen, you could go get citizenship in another country, but in order to become a U.S. citizen, you have to give up your citizenship rights in the countries you're coming from. So it kind of works, there's a whole long tenuous way of doing that.
Yeah.
But it's not easy.
But if you're an American born in another country, you might automatically become a citizen of that country, just as you would be here. And you're also automatically a citizen of the U.S. because you're born of American citizenship parents, right?
Yes, and that's how it works, except it comes down to a question of passports. And you're traveling, and that it comes down to your national identity. And if you, some people use the dual citizenship that they'll leave as an American, enter another country on their other passport, going back. The government has problems with people using two passports. And that is usually when it ends up being a question.
I see, okay.
My husband's older half-sister was born when a legal marriage. His father was serving in Britain. He married an English woman and they had a daughter. don't know exactly why this daughter was not counted as an American citizen at that point, but for some reason she wasn't, even though he made supporting after they were divorced, and the army knew about it, everybody knew about it. So when she only had English citizenship. So we thought, well, she was born to an American citizen, she should have a dual citizenship. We tried to get that straightened out, and no, she'd have to renounce her English citizenship in order to become an American. She couldn't be dual. And I never could understand why, because her father was American and it was a legal marriage.
What do you guys think about dual citizenship?
Well, I have a son with dual citizenship.
Okay.
He was born in Mexico.
Okay.
And he was born to American parents. For us, it wasn't much of a problem. We went down to the embassy about a few weeks after he was born, wanted his Mexican birth certificate, took out a U.S. passport for him. And he spent most of his life as a American citizen in this country, and recently he got a Mexican passport too, so he has those two passports.
Yeah. One concern I have, and I haven't thought this through, is that in Mexico, for example, when they have an election, they do campaigning up here in the U.S. among the hundreds of thousands of Mexican dual citizens and Mexican citizens who can vote back in Mexico. And I think this occurs with some other countries that have large numbers of their citizens living in the U.S. But it just kind of worries me that what if you had conflict between the two countries? Which one would you be loyal to? As I say, I haven't thought that through.
Well, wouldn't it, as we were talking about this question, I'm thinking, well, all right, you have this, in the oath he was talking about, for example.
Yeah.
All right, he made certain comments. Probably, I would think in the end, not being a lawyer, it really comes down to what do you do? In other words, if Mexico and the United States go to war with each other, which side do you decide to take? Which side do you decide to take?
Yeah.
Okay, well, once you do that, I think you've pretty well said to the other guys, I'm not on your side anymore, whichever side it is.
Yeah.
So I think what it probably comes down to in the end, it's not necessarily what sort of contract you enter into when you become a citizen of a country, but it's what your actions are when the time comes to make a decision on one of these issues.
And a number of times, if you have dual citizenship with a country that has mandatory military service, they'll say usually at 18, if people are going to decide to.
Israel would be a good example.
Israel's a good example, and if you've got dual, if you do not want to serve that military service, then they will end up taking the other citizenship.
Oh, wait.
Like if they have American Israeli, if they decide that they're not going to complete that service, then they will give up their Israeli citizenship and become American, so they don't have to serve the military duty. That does come into play too. That for many years was the biggest reason that people renounced one part of their dual.
I see. The Israeli military service is 3 or 4 years. It's not a light commitment.
The oath that you read us is what people who want to become citizens swear to?
Correct.
Wow.
As when you're sworn in as a citizen.
Right.
I think, wasn't there something recently with Trump where if a child was born to American citizens, say in Germany, because the father was in the army, that they were not automatically American citizens and the parents would have to apply for citizenship for their kid? Do you remember that?
Well, no, they're working somewhere about the naturalization law, which is what that is. Essentially saying that anyone born in America, well, born on American soil, an American citizen, has American citizenship too. They're working on changing that for the people that are coming here to have babies. And I don't know.
But that was not it.
But
He
in
was
American,
saying if you were born to American parents, like overseas in Germany, the parents would have to apply for citizenship for their own child.
you have to, I don't know if you have to apply for citizenship, but you have to let the embassy, let somebody know, if you're born in a military hospital, you're born on American soil. So, no matter if you're born in a military facility, it's automatic. But if you're born in a European hospital, or some sort, then you have to go through, and there's procedures to go through to make it an official birth. It doesn't just happen. You know, even going through, like, you could go through, take a birth certificate or whatever, and do it, but you know, I know a little bit about this because our daughters have dual citizenship. And in order for them to have dual citizenship, they were born in America, but they also have birth certificates from my husband's country. And we had to go through and fill out the forms and notify them that they were born to a New Zealand father. So that there are processes in place. It's not just that everyone born to an American person is automatically an American citizen, no matter where they are in the country. Because if you're born in France, in a French hospital, technically you're French. You know, it doesn't matter who your parents are. Technically, according to them, you were born in France, and so there's lots of ins and outs of this. It gets very complicated.
Interesting. Well, we're not gonna solve that one, but it's fascinating. And there's conflict between the oath and the reality, which is fascinating to me. Next one. This is fascinating because we talk about it often. What is the rule of law? The rule of law. We talk about it all the time. We venerate the American system because we generally have or enforce a rule of law.
I think simply you could say it's a contract of rights and responsibilities between citizens and the government.
Okay, that's a nice
That's
answer.
a very good answer, but, it would be kind of tough to enforce.
Well, that's what government is all about.
Yeah.
It is about enforcing it.
Yeah.
But wouldn't you just, what if you just said it's the words of the Constitution?
But I didn't.
No, I mean, what if one person?
Yeah, right, Grant, don't put words in his mouth.
So what you're saying is whatever people agree to?
Well, in a sense, yes, that is, we are all agreeing, all of us in the room are agreeing to obey the laws of this country. And we may want to change some of the laws, we may not be happy with some of the laws, but we all agree in order to live together, that we work together and we try to obey the laws as best as we can within our conscience and what we can do, as citizens. And the government has the right to enforce that, and they also have the responsibility to protect us while we're doing that.
I think this fellow would pass the immigration test.
Here, let me say.
Any other thoughts on that? The rule of law. I mean, you gave a pretty comprehensive answer.
That's a very good answer. I like that answer.
Yeah.
I just kind of I'm trying to think of examples that, don't fit into that.
That don't fit into that. Well, you're saying if someone disagrees with the law, which this gentleman said could be the case, if you disagree with it so vehemently that you challenge it, then you're subject to the penalties imposed for violating that law. But some people would call that civil disobedience, which, going back to what Walden Pond and Thoreau, is considered to be a legitimate tactic by people who feel strongly enough, but they have to be subject to the penalties of the law for their civil disobedience, right?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to think of, I mean, many court cases are over what is the law, and is that consistent with the Constitution? The question, for example, of presidents in the past or whenever, assume that they are above the law. And what I don't know is, what is the law in that case?
Well, the law is what is prescribed in statute, national, state, city ordinances. To me, that seems pretty simple, I'm sure it isn't.
Well, here's the not simple. And I don't wanna dominate the whole conversation, but I'm just curious
Well,
right
you
now.
tried to put words in his mouth.
But what about the Department of Justice decision not to indict a sitting president? Is that in an ordinance, or was that a law that was passed?
That was a memo that the DOJ put out for guidance.
So, but what is the standing of something like that?
Well, but they would have to base it, whether their interpretation is right or wrong, on a law.
Right.
So it's the law that underpins it, and then this
No, I
would.
don't think that's true, I don't think that's right.
Okay,
No, I
okay,
don't think that's
okay,
right.
what was the
I
issue?
think it's simply because of sort of the common sense thought that you don't want your president tied up in court when he should be doing the country's business.
Well, I understand that, but what's that have to do with the law of who has what right to make a decision? Where's the law in that one?
It's a memo that's supposed to give guidance that you do not prosecute or indict the city president. You gotta
But
wait
also if he did shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue, he would be arrested and they would follow the law.
Well,
Even though he thinks he will be.
right,
Well, I understand that, you're right, it was a memo, and it was a process, a procedure from the Department of Justice, that they wouldn't do that. But the question is, what law applies when there's a disagreement?
And in my sense, and the lady and I are probably in a little disagreement here, they have to base it on something. They can't simply, the court cannot decree a law. It has to go back somewhere to something.
It's just an opinion.
Constitution, law, it's an opinion.
It's an opinion, yeah.
But it was-
But it's an opinion based on something, that's what I'm getting.
It was
And I'm-
part of the executive branch of the government that decided that they were not going to, that you could not, should not, we ought not to, because common sense or whatever reason, indict another section of the executive branch, namely the president.
The DOJ is not really executive.
Yeah, it is.
It is.
It is?
Yeah. Yeah.
I thought justice was different.
No, it's different in a way, but it's part of the executive.
But if it was just a memo, and even if it makes sense in some ways, de facto, it becomes, in the absence of a specific law that says the president cannot do these things, it's a decision that's made and say, well, we've decided, we've told our boss that he can get away with anything.
My bet is, and it'd be fun to look it up, my bet is that their opinion goes back to court precedents, which in turn are based on interpretation of laws. They can simply not, there's a legal term that escapes me right now, they cannot simply decree something. It has to be based on something. Now, their interpretation might be different from yours as to what can be done and can't be done, but it's based on something.
Yeah, I'm wondering, where did that law come from, that you cannot indict or
There is
convict?
a law, but I think the idea was that if somebody did something very egregious, like shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue,
You see,
the
we keep coming
Congress
back
would
to
then
that.
impeach them, remove them from office, and then they'd be arrested and tried.
Checks and balances.
There is a
congressional
system in place.
oversight.
It's all based on the rule of law, Rick. That's our question.
And hopefully, when they come out of office, they'll go right into handcuffs.
And how is the rule of law defined then?
Everybody must follow the law, obey the law, government must obey the law. And that's where your question is, it's prompted, I'm guessing, and no one is above the law, that's what.
And have a similar understanding of what the law says and means.
Well, similar is
Let it put the
interpreted.
judiciary out of business.
Okay, there you go, all right.
Okay. Okay.
Sorry about that.
The Federalist Papers supported the passage of the U.S. Constitution. Famous papers, really kind of, background for the Constitution, and it's legislative intent, you might say. Name one of the authors of the Federalist Papers.
Alexander Hamilton.
John Jay, Hamilton.
James Madison.
Very good, very good. Hamilton would have supported a monarchy. He was very strong central government. Madison favored the Constitution and its strength, and its strong powers, but later, as back in Virginia, he became a very strong supporter of states' rights, which he basically changed his philosophy along the way, which is not illegitimate. Okay. I'm throwing this question in. What was one of the major concerns of people who opposed the Constitution's ratification? No reason you should know this.
That was in our little book here.
Was
They
it?
didn't like it.
There was no Bill of Rights.
Right.
And Madison didn't want a Bill of Rights. He was the author of the Constitution. He didn't think it was needed. But others, like his buddy Jefferson, felt very strongly it should be in there. So they agreed during the debate over ratification that the first thing they'd do once they convened Congress was to propose and enact a Bill of Rights, which was done within a year or two after the ratification of the Constitution. What is, this is another question for prospective citizens, what is the economic system in the United States?
Capitalism.
Okay. What, I'm sorry? Capitalism, the answers here are capitalist economy and market economy, which, in other words, capitalist economy meaning the economy is operated by individuals rather than by the national government. Many European governments are largely socialist, that is, government owns the means of production. But ours is the opposite. Okay. What are two rights of everyone living in the United States? What are two rights? What do we have rights inherent in our being as citizens? Okay. Liberty and the pursuit of happiness, that's kind of aspirational. What would be a way of operationalizing liberty? I mean, liberty, I know what you're saying. They would be a little more specific here.
Freedom to worship
Okay.
who we want to.
Okay. Freedom of religion, or
Association.
speech, that'd be an operational.
Freedom to bear arms.
Peaceful protest.
Bear arms,
Assembly.
assembly, petition the government, bear arms, religion, expression, freedom of expression and freedom of speech seem like the same thing to me, but they may be different. Well, flag burning is considered an expression, freedom of expression, freedom of speech.
Well, and money, spending money on campaigns is freedom. That's a key issue in a lot of the voting rights, and, that's freedom of expression. What do you think?
Spend it, yeah, that's good, a fascinating question, because Citizens United says that money is speech. Okay. Technically, I think you could parse it. Money isn't speech, money operationalizes speech. I'm just getting it.
When protest, nonviolent protest is a form of expression. Nobody even speaks in a lot of it. But they're physical, we have the right to stick our tongue out and it has nothing to do with it.
Yeah, but money's inert until it's used, or at least I think of it that way. Maybe I'm shading this too fine. I don't know. But to expression, speech, assembly, petition, government, religion, bear arms. Okay. The idea of self-government is in the first 3 words of the Constitution. What are those words?
We the people.
You have it. Good for you. Here. We the people. That's okay.
You the corporation.
Name one war fought. This is a completely different type of question. Name one war fought by the United States in the 1800s.
Civil War.
Civil War.
Mexican War.
Mexican War of 1846 to 48.
48, I think.
That was in the 1700s. War of 1812.
Spanish American.
What about 1898?
Yeah.
Yeah.
War against the Sioux in this.
What's that?
The war against the Sioux tribe in the 1860s
That's interesting.
that America lost.
The
That brings to mind war. Who has the power to declare war?
Congress.
Does Congress ever do it?
Not anymore.
Pearl Harbor, we did, but that was a decision that, everybody knew had to be made immediately. But Korea, Vietnam, were not declared by Congress ever. It's just, over the year, the Constitution envisioned a strong Congress and a weak president. But over the years, maybe because of things like the necessity of a president taking action quickly in Korea or Vietnam, although it wasn't quickly in Vietnam, taking action, the president has become, I would say, the dominant branch rather than the Congress.
Or the perception that our oil supply is being diminished. The reason for declaring war, the perception that our oil supply is being diminished, our natural resources that people believe are absolutely essential towards our economy are being denied to us. Would those be some of the reasons that people might fight wars?
I think you're being a bit sarcastic.
I am. No, I mean, I think that's, when you say we feel the necessity to fight a war, in the moment, in many of the recent, quote, military adventures we've had, which we would describe as war, the reasons, stated or unstated, have to do with lots of different things. One is defending freedom, defending the flag, defending our land, defending the resources that we're used to. Those are all part of the reasons for declaring war and feeling the compulsion to fight a war. Is that right or wrong? I mean, some people want to declare war because they don't like Christians or Jews or Muslims. I mean, to me, that's what this whole series is about, is that the Constitution is an attempt to make these issues clear, and it's very difficult. So we've amended it lots of times.
Not that many times.
Right, but 10,000 attempts, as you said.
Yeah.
But the point is that these issues are very complex. I just looked up, what is the proper time that an amendment should have to be approved? And, for some people, it's very clear, 7 years. Well, if it was that clear, I wouldn't have spent 20 minutes trying to read all the court cases that related to how much time can or should pass between the introduction of an amendment and its ratification. If it was 7 years, it was that simple. Why are all these court cases being fought?
Are you referring to
Because they
the
don't agree
ERA?
with the 7-year limit.
Right, well, they don't, it wasn't just the 7-year limit, it was on what basis are decisions being made about who has the right, which section of government has the right to declare how long or how short it takes. And if we say, well, the most recent case, that's one way of looking. And what I'm trying to bring up on all these is that these issues in this whole series, you know, it could be race, it could be money, capitalism, communism, socialism, sex, gender, war. They are very complex. And we've got a system written in the Constitution that says, to the best of our knowledge, we're gonna do our best to make a system that works. But it works because we do have checks and balances. And to me, that's the great adventure and the challenge and the agony and the anxiety that we're trying to deal with here. And it ain't simple. Anytime, I mean, today, who has the right to declare that no one should fly from Europe in the next 30 days? Who has the right to do that? Well, the president believes he does, and a lot of people believe that he does. Well, what if people say, wait a minute, that's not fair under amendment number 16. There are decisions every single day. Watch, in the next, tomorrow, these decisions that we're talking about and are rooted in the Constitution, no matter what we decide about this virus, they're constitutional issues.
Yeah.
Privacy, you know? I mean, this is what I think tears people apart. Because if you have a simple answer to who has the right to do what, we're not thinking it through.
And we've fought a war over it.
Yeah, lots of them.
Well, I mean, civil war we fought over that issue. Let's see, we've gone through the questions. I have a couple of quick ones. Do we need an additional amendment or two now?
We agree on that.
Well, for example, the electoral college, that is kicked around endlessly.
Right.
Because it is not a truly democratic procedure. And not that it was intended to be, it wasn't intended to be. So do we need to revise it, keep it somehow? By the way, I looked up another related issue. Could we change the proviso that each state has 2 United States senators? Wyoming and South Dakota, as well as California and Texas. And the Constitution is a little ambiguous on it. It says that this cannot be amended, that proviso, at least as I read it. And I have to look it up. So.
There should be, in my opinion, something done, but I don't think that it will ever get done because of the constraints on making a change. But
You mean how hard it is to amend?
right, but it would seem in the spirit of fairness, if we still have that every vote should count, just like the one next to you, as opposed to like the states you mentioned versus California. You know, people living in California, their vote doesn't count as much as somebody in North Dakota because of the electoral college, because of the senators.
And yet, if we were to go to popular election, given how close some recent elections, recent presidential elections have been from 1960 to the present, if we had a close election, it would take years to resolve it because every voting unit, thousands of them across the country, would be involved in the recount. I'm just pointing out a practical problem. I'm not saying that popular isn't.
I mean, I'd like to see DC have representation. You know, there's, I don't know how many 100,000 people living in the district.
600,000 or so, I don't know the number.
And they have no representation.
They have a delegate.
Right, but not voting.
Not voting, yeah. And no senator.
But if you live in Wyoming, you probably don't like that idea.
Yeah, right. And that's why it'll never pass
Right.
the constitutional hurdles, because a number of small states. And And originally, geography was critical. The Constitution never would have been enacted without that compromise.
Right.
One person, one vote in Congress and geography for the states. What was it, the New Jersey Compromise, I think?
Jim, do we want to take a few minutes and let each table kind of figure that actual question about amendments and changing or better? Let's just take 5 minutes or so and let everyone kind of converse among themselves. So just by table, and then we'll get back and kind of do a consensus.
As to whether there should be any additional
Just
amendments?
whether you think there should there be another amendment, or you want to talk about the ERA? Do you think that they should be allowed to go through and redo it, or not redo it, or whatever you think? But just kind of this concept of if we have the Constitution, obviously we've learned over the last month that, you know, it works. Amazingly, surprisingly, it's worked really well for a very long time. Is there something that you think would make it better, or do you think that's something that, you know, they should, if we're gonna write a letter to our representatives and senators and say, you should think about doing this, what would it be? So, I know every single table has opinions on this.
Because you got a bunch of deterrents. It was drawn up that way. It was never intended to be. We need a democracy. I'd say we mock rule guards everywhere. Me, you, her, don't let them he, her, doing. That's one person, one vote. Yeah. Let's have a vote on it. Now, most states have the Illinois Constitution of 1970.
I don't like that idea. I think that ruined.
Couldn't.
Voting for the Senate.
So no about
Go back to they were appointed by the state. And then the guy went up to Washington and screwed us over. Get fired. Right then.
Yeah, that's
In other words, you don't go before
Under the law.
I never thought of that. I think it's very good. Well, and inequality.
State by state, again, the state, this would more or less.
Immoral.
What else?
Yes, the no Why she's never. Nothing has ever been changed for the rest of the people. Certain we're getting close to the
Right there would be the question. Very significant. That's the hard part.
Very
So that will.
society now than it is.
The opportunity.
The other guy,
Be
wants to tell it all.
clearly that there's a difference in what they have now and there are some serious inequalities.
Large
So I think there is evaluating, to me, there is a need.
Where the architecture.
Enhance those sorts of women.
Just like in the 1800s.
Yeah.
Political. Yeah, in the 1800s, adding the state.
You know, I can make this percent. Is the Constitution, is it one north,
Nobody really knows.
So if you're looking at like.
That's the thing, nobody knows. People like us, somebody that's 25 years old.
You had two state senators who were really savvy politically, because they said, look, we want to help you with what Puerto Rico.
Is that a fraction of it? No, I don't. But it's, well, I meant it goes back to, if the this has been changed in our, well, changed the wording, right? It's as it is, as long as no concept.
Every.
So we're.
Whether you want to belong to the original law, that's entirely up to you. Doesn't matter. I'm sure Ron didn't have a problem talking about all of the last. Until 500 years ago. This way is that the United States won't know because it will be something within our history.
Yeah.
a lot of Constitution amendments.
And Congress
will
be
bringing
these proposals.
Well, let's just-
Democrats and
the
Republicans.
conditions now.
And then what we do,
That's right, we both can.
Many people. It comes close. As long as you don't equate the religion part of it. The other part of it. I agree, but another to me, those conditions that progressive would have to sign these laws and thought they would
Didn't have to override it.
Probably original time balance is like. Times change. Right. So,
You and I
your question about the CRA is interesting. I'm not sure where Carol was, but,
I'm not saying that their system is, what was it, Churchill said that democracy is the
One
best
side
form
of
of
the
government,
argument.
first, the worst form of government, except for all the rest.
The reason everybody is.
So you're never gonna do it.
The reason the Constitution is because there might be a need to have a
So I agree. The War Powers Act probably tried to look at
Capitalism is in its true form. It's the best, that is the best one.
Immediately that
When you
the
the
corrupt
president would take action and then ask to come back to us in 2 months or 4 months or something. And that's how that works.
To be able to exchange your services and actually report your labor.
But it seems to see
So that, I think that's the
Labor
intention.
rather
Make a long list of rights that
de facto,
they're more
force them to re-election, which is state, or you force them to re-election, which is state, don't equate to the same thing. Be specific.
Whatever you're going to like, you're going to take the vacation.
How many variables do you have? I'm not trying to be.
I don't know, I honestly don't know.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people.
Somebody
You're below the poverty line, so right there, variables.
When I was looking through your
You'll be here all night. I have a brother who lives in Louisiana, so I do know about that. You give me any example, that's why I asked for specifics. Give me any example, and I can usually, I'll say pick it apart. You can usually find the fault in the individual for saying minimum wage. When I was a kid, I chose not to be that way in my life, and I was that way for a while. I made certain decisions within my life, and I changed my life for the better. You're trying to add life isn't fair. Of course it's not. You don't tear down an economic system. That is privilege to work as long as you don't corrupt it. What are you asking in specifics?
So of course ours isn't the
You
only
mean
way.
the friend that I have that's actually paralyzed and makes more than I do? But you're grasping at straws. I just pointed out a specific, example, and I do too. I have a friend who lives out in the South Shore, he makes more money than I do, he's can find I know he went to college.
It's the same with good company. Everybody watches the tape.
So you're very.
Yes.
I mean, I've had this debate. That's great. She went long.
It's a few minutes.
The prime minister's term is over, and
Worked
it's
in
5
Central
years.
America, South America, and the last.
Often, the prime minister steps down.
That's
before
okay.
5 years.
We're allowed to not do it.
And calls it.
Corporations do some,
It's a
political,
political.
strong to free people from lifetime.
What should the safety?
I don't know.
You know what, let's actually. But what should the safety say? That's kind of actually condemning, because I don't agree with the way you I didn't say it should. You're assuming. I asked. What should it be?
And the other one, I mean, they're relatively small. I always do. What was that? What they just don't have.
How do you figure that out? So now you're asking, anyway, and I'll use me as an example, so you can direct your contempt or your hatred.
But I think we put.
I'll use me as an example, say, where is it stated that my life should go towards anything else besides what I deem necessary? Because if you take my, libertarians, I don't actually subscribe to political ideals. I don't know, actually. I know, you're debating, I'm debating, I'm not gonna say yes to it. I'm not a libertarian. They stand for things that I don't believe in, so I can't actually subscribe to any political party because I can't say wrong because I'm not smart, I'm just not, I don't follow.
I drive. Those are roads that we all use. I cannot figure out what, you don't believe that
Not at all. They just think, still can't pay. How would you go about for dealing with it?
It'd be a freedom of speech issue. I mean, that's what Citizens United is all about.
But I agree.
That's relative. It functioned before you, and that's what I never said that you shouldn't have a tax. You don't need to tax my work. If you have a consultant or some places that you can tax, tax, I mean, for example,
I mean, this.
how many citizens would go in and buy a tax on it, but after you eat it, you take it and pay your tax on it. But your property tax, even after you get off the home, I just did last year, this is a specific example. I am now indebted in servitude for this town, especially I pay close to $5,000 for house basement every year. For what? What am I paying for? My roads are garbage, I don't have curbs. My city infrastructure is actually pretty terrible. The hardware is
So part of
my
the
fire department
well,
is
then,
I mean, they're lavish.
money is.
My wife is retired in college. I'm not advocating to take.
You argue it out.
They have done.
No, they're stabbed.
Now, the party that we.
What are we trying to do as a society?
Billionaires.
It's raise taxes.
Yeah,
It's raise taxes. That's the easiest way. It's raise taxes. What do we all do?
Prove that I
Give
do
the
something
safety net
business.
of the architect.
Worries me because they're damning the issues of
Everybody got a right. You can go out and buy all the budget, everybody got one single shit, all $1 million max. Everybody had to do
Public money for elections. You know, what, that's not the right term, but it used to be, you could file a business license, like, should be so much. What is well, there are some limits on that, and there's, if you take the federal money, you can't take the government, so a lot of people reject the federal money.
I would disagree with you. Because it makes you get a bitch box.
I wonder how you operate we don't like lobbying, you're pushing lobbying, we're gonna need lobbying to argue your case.
Back to the exact the original.
Money could be.
The Constitution should be left
The other
alone.
one might be some.
For the prime example of
Guidelines or
setting
regulations.
But that's my opinion.
But.
But you're not gonna
You
get
gotta
a
know
better.
who you're working
Yes.
for.
The only thing that's gonna matter is what works.
What has been and
There will be so much intersectionality
So if you
introduced into it. We're just perverting it.
Yeah, no, that's exactly, I think it's
Yes.
Not me, I have no question.
Oh, people.
For somebody that was in Texas.
And
For a state election. That seems to be happening.
Yeah, I, having lived near Washington, go to Washington. Yeah, where? I mean, I don't know why you'd want to. As long as they want power, but they're miserable, I don't think.
that's where I'm comfortable with that.
Being
Part of it might be going back to the political parties from
people fly back to parties in Texas. Who's our senator?
Not off topic, but it's just a country of freedom. You feel like you have
Have two phones.
What did you think about that?
But now,
Your citizens.
people
I
in Washington.
Very orderly.
We shouldn't do something.
Very safe.
Yeah.
And,
I mean, there's lots of, yeah, I don't know.
That's exactly right, on both sides.
Why it's going back That's
You
correct.
can't have your cake and eat it. Have you ever been to a not friendly country that is not like ours? Singapore is really friendly, especially to tourism. Have you ever been to a not friendly country? And compared it against our system? I'm not saying this is a person. Have you ever been to Iraq? Have you ever been to Afghanistan? Have you ever been to Mali? I'm being specific with some of the ones I've been to.
Well, that's why we hate them.
Or is that just-
Yeah.
I was the reason why this is. And then come back here and complain about the weather. You don't live it. Exactly.
So, okay, I think.
We should probably summarize and then.
We should, oh yeah, it's 8:30.
Yeah.
I turned mine off.
Oh, no, you don't want to.
Sticker on the board.
Okay, where is I'm gonna knock on the table again.
Personal things. Why did she go to California?
I'll write the hour right here. Okay, if we could just take a minute.
Oh, really?
Anyway, actually, this is kind of bittersweet. We're just gonna take a couple minutes. We can, see, did anyone come up with anything that you think we all wanna sign a letter, do a petition, to give to Congress to say what we're looking at?
We didn't come up with anything that everybody would want to sign.
Okay, half, do we
All
find
we
something?
did, in our group, all we did was we came up with some issues that maybe people want to talk about, maybe they don't. The three issues that we came up with was, one gentleman, thinks that we should go back to a system for, electing senators through state legislatures. All right, he thinks that should be talked about.
Not voting for senators in federal elections.
Right. Some people thought that maybe, the ERA should be discussed and, perhaps added to the Constitution at this time, and, it was pretty, I think it was pretty unanimous in the group that we'd like to see more transparency in government, is where money is, put out to influence, public officials, and what could be done to shine light on, bribery and corruption.
For pandemics.
Whatever issue you'd like to deal with.
Anything else, anybody?
Yeah, we had the ERA, and we had, for the electoral college to be eliminated, and term limits for the legislature.
Okay. And
We talked about all those things.
Yeah, we had the ERA, the question of equal representation and the presidential powers, although we sort of decided that Congress just needed to step up and do their job.
Assert itself.
Yes.
Assert itself, right.
go back to doing your job. That's what, we were discussing whether or not the Constitution should be amended or how it should stand. Anyway, this is, when we first came up with this series of programs, this is what we had hoped for. And response from everybody from the community has been incredible. And we are so grateful to all of you and those who have been to past programs for making it so enjoyable. I will say on each table is a questionnaire, and the last question on it asks you whether you would be interested in continuing discussions in a less formal setting.
And if there are people who would like to do that, we have a group that would consider getting meetings together to continue discussing a lot of these issues. Excuse me, a lot of these issues that you've brought up, because this will not, I mean, it's not going to stop here because it is so relevant to everything that is happening to us every day. I'm going to ask Rick to explain the little blue cards on the table.
We were looking for what are the issues that we should deal with and how do we make it easier to learn about the Constitution and the issues related to it. And so I did a lot of searching, and you'll see on the bookmarks, there's lots of sources. There's really good stuff. It's very interesting. A lot of curricula for schools, elementary, middle, and high school, and a lot of times they just read a section of the Constitution and then they say they have people with different perspectives write what it means from different perspectives. So some of these are very, very interesting looking at. So I encourage you to look at these. The interesting ones for me were the More Perfect podcast on public radio. And there's a whole series, I think I explained, they commissioned music to express the Constitution and Bill of Rights in music, jazz and rock music and folk music. And they put together an album, but they had very, very thorough and fascinating feature stories about the Constitution and how it plays out in our life through history and now. It's worth listening to on public radio. So there are lots of things. The Annenberg Guide's really good. If you want some fun, an easy way to learn, this book we bought from a company that has sold millions of them. And in the book, the title is U.S. Constitution and Fascinating Facts About It. And if you look on their website, and it's on this blue card, the company that produced this pocket Constitution has a whole bunch of games, quizzes, contests, fun activities that teach a lot about the words in the Constitution, what they have meant, and what they can mean now. It's worth looking at. It doesn't cost anything. I think I'm of the school that I love seeing everybody here, and I hope more people get the pleasure that I've had in looking at some of this stuff, because it's fascinating. I've been reading, and I don't sleep well because I think, well, that's interesting. I wonder who knows about that. So it's wonderful stuff. I did say a couple weeks ago, we went to the play. If you want to get some real challenge, go see the Broadway play called What the Constitution Means to Me. It's in Chicago. And it's at the Water Tower Place Theater. It's very interesting. And it was highly rated in Broadway and around the country, and it's worth looking at. So, but this is a good resource to start for your own entertainment. If you've got time when you're taking the train or while driving at high speeds, just
Thank you, Ray.
That's a good resource.
We're not recommending you drive at high speeds and read on your phone, please. So going back to the questionnaires, if you have a minute and want to fill it out tonight, the box is over here on the side. This will be in the library, so you're welcome to bring the questionnaires back at any point and drop them in the box. They're going to be on a table as you come in to the left of the library, or sorry, the box is going to be. We have a couple more copies of the Constitution booklet available and some more bookmarks for anybody that wants to take a couple extra. I would like to sincerely thank Jim Nolan for giving us his time this evening. You know, if you have any questions or want to have any recommendations, stop any of us on the street, stop by, I'll make you a coffee. Come on, you know, just talk to us, but keep the conversation going. And thank you all so much for participating.
Thank you.